project titled Check Your Privilege, the Framing of Privilege by Right and Left-Wing Political Commentators, mentor Katie Crowder. Okay, Mary Catherine, you're on.
I looked into the word privilege. Something I was really interested in studying was the correlation between language and thought. There's the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which says that our language determines like how we see the world around us. So for example, in a language that does not differentiate between like two different colors, then it proposes that the speakers will not be able to differentiate between those colors. And while this hypothesis has like been disproven, there's many linguists that still believe that there's some relationship between language and thought. And one of the ways that we see this is through frames. So all words and phrases connect to like outside knowledge, and this outside knowledge is frames. So I studied the framing around the word privilege. I found that there seems to be like two main different usages of the word privilege. There's one that's more positive and one that's more negative. And so I focused on the more negative privilege, which is used in phrases like white privilege, male privilege, class privilege, and other phrases similar to that. And I also found that like this privilege is believed to largely be unearned, and it usually comes with a very negative connotation. So I read a lot of sociological studies on privilege. I wanted to see when this more negative definition of privilege first started to appear. And I found that like there was little use of this type of privilege before 1980s. And then the most prominent essay I found was Peggy McIntosh's White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. That was the most prominent essay and one of like the first to really use the term white privilege when she was coming up with examples of like what white privilege is. So, and then after the 1980s, there was a lot of increased interest in studying privilege. I also looked at several linguistic studies focusing on like how language affects a person's perception of the world. I also found an article by Lakoff and Johnson, which proposed that we interpret our world through metaphorical language. For example, ideas are food. So you can say that's a half-baked idea or that's food for thought. I also looked at one article by Lederer, which considered the term anchor baby and how it has taken on a very negative connotation in recent times. And so Lederer proposed that this anchor baby was its connotation became very negative due to a conceptual feedback loop. So there's a lot of like existing knowledge surrounding that term, and that existing knowledge like leads to negative assumptions, and those so when you think of that term, you also subconsciously think about all those like negative assumptions, and they kind of imbue the word with their negativity. So that's why the connotation becomes so negative. So the research questions I considered were how is privilege being framed? Is that framing pejorating its connotation? And pejorating means that like the connotation becomes very negative. And are conservatives and liberals framing privilege in different ways? So I collected data from an equal amount of right and left-wing political commentators, including Rush Limbaugh, Bill O'Reilly, Jon Stewart, Charles Blow, and more. So the data sources were transcriptions of radio broadcasts and YouTube videos, and also some written articles. And I put all the data in an Excel spreadsheet and color-coded it based on the political ideology of the speaker. So red for conservative and blue for liberal. And then I isolated the individual usages of privilege and then determined its framing and grouped uses with similar framing together. Then I also looked at the examples of privilege that the data sources gave and separated them based on political ideology, and then grouped them into groups of similar examples. So I only focused on the most salient frames, which were privilege as an entity or an object, which included as like a possession, a gift, a tool, or advantage. and then also privilege as a measurable entity and privilege as a systemic product. So privilege as an entity or object, it was framed as a possession. So you have white privilege, it's something that you possess. And then privilege was also framed as a gift. So I found that in many examples, the privileged people were like passive receptors of their privilege. So in this example, privilege is defined as a special right, advantage, or immunity granted to a particular group. So this group is being like given their privilege. Then I found that privilege was also framed as a tool or an advantage, and that this frame acted within like a larger metaphor for life as a game. So I had several examples that called privilege an unfair advantage. And when you use the word unfair, it brings to mind a game with rules. And so in a game, there's like winners and there's losers, and then there's like an object of a game. And then there can be advantages, in this case, privilege. And so if life is a game, then the winners would be the privileged and the losers would be the underprivileged. And the object of the game is kind of like success in life. Like in the second example, the speaker says they use every ounce of that privilege to amass fortunes and power. So the fortunes and power is like the object of this game that privilege is being used to win. And then I have another example that the speaker is calling people not to use their privileges in competition with other people. And so that phrase, in competition, like definitely brings to like mind of a game. And so like we're competing with other people. And it also says like every citizen must recognize his or her privilege and not use it, essentially. So I found like as the privileged are using the unfair advantages, they're like winning the game of life, but also like causing the underprivileged to be the ones that lose. And so there's been in some of my examples like a call for them to not use this unfair advantage, because to use the unfair advantage is like akin to like cheating in the game. And I found that there's a lot of like guilt associated with having privilege. In this last example, O'Reilly says this is the usual white guilt liberal stuff, and then Stewart says like I don't feel guilty. So when privilege comes up, there's like there's guilt associated with it, and because like in this metaphor of life as a game, having privilege is like cheating in the game. So I also found that privilege was framed as a measurable entity. So privilege can have an amount. In this example, it says they go, I'm not getting any privilege. And they say any rather than saying like, I'm not getting privilege, or I'm getting privilege, or I'm not getting privilege. So by using the word any, it gives privilege a certain amount. So like you can have some or a lot or a little. And when privilege has an amount, you can start comparing that amounts between people. And I found that was something that came up in my data a lot. In this example, it says there are certainly women who are more privileged than other women. Then I also found that privilege was framed to have size. In this example, the privileges are enormous. I also found another example where it has like large privilege and also like small privilege, and compared the two. So there's like less impactful examples and then the larger institutional front of privileges. And so, and this speaker is saying that the larger privileges have a greater impact than the smaller privileges. So its size is based on its impact. I also found privilege could be framed as a systemic product. So privilege is bestowed systemically and is connected to how a society interacts with the group. So in this example, Stewart is saying white people, males like set the system. So privilege is connected to like how, or like who sets the system or who is in control of that. So since white people set the system, they are the ones that are privileged. Then this system is said to like be rigged to like continue giving the privilege to their privilege and then like discriminating against the underprivileged. So this one example says like when one has the luxury of not being forced to compensate for societal oppression based on basic identity, one is in fact privileged in that society. So when the system isn't discriminating against them, those people are privileged. So their privilege is bestowed by having the society in their favor and not against them. So, and also in this example, that says white folks have kind of dominated society. So like the white people are said to have the privilege because of their like dominant position in society. So like they have privilege based on like how they interact with society and how society interacts with them. So one of my research questions was like, is the framing of privilege causing its pejoration and connotation? And so I found that a lot of the frames like weren't intrinsically negative, but when used together, they could create something that was like very negative. And so in this example, it says, in the context of gender, or even the lack of it, it's only evident that men are born with more ingrained advantages in society than any other group within the spectrum, such as better pay, career expectations, larger jurisdiction over their bodies, along with certain questions they just never have to ask themselves. So this one example combines a lot of the frames I mentioned earlier. So men are born with the ingrained advantages. So like born with puts them as the passive receptors of their privilege, which goes with the gift frame. And then it connects privilege to like ingrained advantages, which connects to the advantage frame. And then the phrase in society connects privilege to like how they interact with society, which connects to the systemic product frame. I also found that this example connected to the life as a game metaphor because the advantages of better pay and career expectations help men to better exceed over women in this like life as a game. And so all those frames are really like acting together to create a lot of like negative assumptions that are then associated with the word privilege. And so all those like negative ideas then create a negative connotation for the word privilege. Next, I discovered that there was like two different ways people were like defining privilege. There was a positive and a negative way. And so the positive way was they're saying like privilege is what these people can do. So the privilege can do this, they can do that. And then the negative way of defining it was like what the privileged do not have to do due to their privilege, and then also what the underprivileged are not able to do. So I found that conservatives tended to favor the positive way of defining privilege, while liberals favored the negative way. Then I also took examples of privilege given by the sources and separated them based on political ideology so I could compare and contrast them. And I found several similarities between liberals and conservatives. So they both agreed that privilege can be like protection, and this protection can be from like violence, harassment, and negative assumptions due to one's identity. And then privilege can also be having more material possessions than another group. And then privilege can also be the ability to do something that another group cannot, whether this is to like move to a certain neighborhood or go to certain places, or even the ability to have certain rights or freedoms. I found that liberals and conservatives often agreed on what privilege is, but disagreed on who has this privilege and to what extent it is a factor.
1 minute remaining, Mary Catherine.
Okay. So I also found some differences between liberals and conservatives. For liberals, privilege is also like the obliviousness to your own identity and how that affects you. And then for conservatives, privilege can also include being the receptor of day-to-day kindnesses. And then liberals and conservatives tended to disagree on whether female privilege exists. So like liberals believe that in order for a group to be privileged, they have to be the ones to set the system. And so since the patriarchy sets the system, female privilege cannot exist. But conservatives see privilege more as being the reception of benefits. So they believe that female privilege can exist. So in conclusion, I found the most salient frames to be privilege as a possession, gift, advantage, measurable entity, and systemic product. And also that a conceptual feedback loop involving the life as a game metaphor was negatively affecting privilege's connotation, and that liberals and conservatives agree in many ways on what privilege is, but disagree the most on who has it and the extent of its impact. So a lot of the things I found were similar to what was found in previous sociological studies about privilege, but I also, my study gave greater insight into how people understand privilege, particularly like the difference between conservatives and liberals. And I hope that by having a greater understanding of privilege, we will then be better equipped to address it and have these conversations. So further research could like broaden the scope of this study, or like it could broaden the scope so that like we can see if the trends continue with more people and more data, and if there's any other trends that we have not found. And that's the end.
Awesome.
Thank you for a most enlightening and extremely well presented presentation. So thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you.
So as people are pondering what question they'll ask Mary Katherine in about a half hour, let's move on to Brooke Palmer, undergraduate research fellow, Honors College, Terry Scholar. And the project title that Brooke brings to us is Fighting or Conforming: Unitarian Opinion on Women and Culture. Research mentor, yours truly. Okay, Brooke, you're on.
So I was introduced to the topic of Unitarianism through Dr. Duban's class last year, this semester. And so a lot of the information in my introduction has to do with the information we learned in that class. So because I wanted to start my paper by giving a thorough explanation of what Unitarianism is, the development of the faith. And so basically Unitarianism developed from a long chain of Protestant shifts and changes. So starting from Martin Luther going to the United States through the Puritanism, there was a group of enlightened thinkers who started thinking that they wanted to have a strong belief and confidence in human nature, that people aren't inherently bad and rather that they're inherently good, and that they didn't need to be worried about or feel worried or have anxiety about their sanctification to be safe after death. And so it's through this background of enlightenment that Unitarianism became a very progressive and forward-thinking faith, because they had confidence in people rather than just feeling fear and giving their whole lives to God. They also thought about themselves as people and how they can help each other. And so using this information, I started delving into the Christian Inquirer, which was a 19th century newspaper written by Unitarians. And as I was looking through these columns and these articles, I found out it was very interesting to see that a lot of them were written about feminist thought at the time period, which is very interesting considering that it was written in the 19th century. But more interestingly than that, there were several articles on feminist thought in other societies and other cultures beyond just Unitarianism, which I'm an international studies major, so that's really what I research and look into most of the time anyways, is how different cultures interact with each other. And for a long time, I was very impressed with Unitarianism, progressivism, and forwardism, but I felt that reading these articles about how different cultures interacted revealed a certain type of lack of understanding between our society and other people's society. They lacked the ability to understand perhaps intersectional feminism. And so that's really what I looked into. So what I started with my essay was I looked into how they viewed women as a whole as it begins. And they really focused on appreciating a woman not only for like outside beauty, but also inside beauty, especially intelligence. They valued education of a woman and valuing a woman beyond just as a housekeeper or as you know, a beautiful object per se. And they compare women to treasure chests where the inside is just as beautiful as the outside, to a garden where you can grow and nurture a person. But then I looked into their articles on women in other societies. So specifically, I used their article, Women in Turkey, Women in China, Women in Circasia. And you see that there's a lot of, there's a lack of flow between the articles, you could say, because, for example, in Turkey, they have a sort of praise for how Turkish men treated their women, because they said that despite the fact that women are not referred to as women, but rather as the home and the house, and that they keep the women at home, the respect they have for their wives and their children is very, very valuable. But when you look at their article, Women in China, they are much more critical. The situation is not all that different. The women aren't participating in governments as much. They're not participating in hard work. They're doing more of leisurely activities. But the language in the article becomes much more critical. And the same comparisons can be made between their article on Western European women and Eastern European women. And so I really wanted to analyze why that was. And it could be very easy to just say that they were, in a sense, racist or prejudiced, and that they just wanted to say that the cultures more similar to their own were better. And that can be true to an extent. I think there are a lot more nuanced arguments to that, though. For one thing, it's hard to just go and assume that, because at this time, the Unitarian newspaper, the Christian Inquirer, it didn't have authors on each one of its columns. So the articles very easily could have been written by different people with different opinions. And if they had all been written by the same person, then you could say that, but the different authors may or may not have different viewpoints and different ideas. That being said, I would feel that would be in the responsibility of the editor or the other producers of the newspaper to make sure that the articles corresponded and they weren't putting on this negative prejudice upon themselves, mainly that they had prejudices against other people. And so I wanted to delve into that a little more as well. I think that's a problem we have in modern societies as well, is that we become critical of the ways in which other people view feminism and feminist thought, that even Western liberals, they will be very critical of Eastern cultures on how they are progressing in the ways that they act, because they believe that the way that they are progressing and advancing to a more modern world is the best way. But we fail to take into account culture and how that impacts how people want to be treated. So a very good example of this was their article on Circadian women. So they tell this anecdote about a group of women who were being on their way to be sold as slaves to Constantinople when the women got seized in Germany, and they were like, we can send you back home, we can send you here, you don't have to be sold as like slaves, you can be protected. But the women, they really truly wanted to go there because that would be the better life for them, as opposed to staying at home. They were raised in such a way that the idea that they were slaves was not the concept, it was that they were going to be house givers and caregivers and all of that. And in that way, that's what they wanted as themselves, and to deny them that would be, in a way, not feminist, because you're not giving them a choice. So I think the idea that we as a society, sometimes we fail to understand that progressivism appears differently across different cultures, and the Unitarians didn't at this point as well, but that's not to be faulted to them. First of all, because this was written in the 19th century. So to tell them that they should both remain progressive in feminist thought and in comparative culture analyses would be difficult, because very few people in general were doing that at that time period. But I think it's still important to look back on articles like these and essays like these to fully understand where we can move on from now, from this time period. So I really focused on these inconsistencies at the end of my essay to emphasize the importance of this. I'm sorry my presentation wasn't very long or thorough, but thank you for listening.
No, it was very nice, and it was intriguing, and we can easily see why somebody in international studies would have been attracted to this cross-cultural analysis. And again, I know I have a few questions. I'm sure others do as well. So thank you for a very knowledgeable and concise offering. And if Talia is here, we will move on to her. Has she yet managed to gain access?
Okay, the title of my presentation is The New York Christian Inquirer on Slavery, Progressive and Progressing Viewpoints.
Very good. And you are fully visible to us now.
Good.
So, I'd like to once again thank Cherie for her willingness to keep time. I don't know how late you came to the session. I know we all had difficulty getting in, so don't worry about that. And you will have your full 15 minutes. And then what we will do is open up, since you are the final presenter, we will then open up questions for each presenter one at a time. And it'll go just splendidly. So yes, please do present for us.
Okay, so like Brooke, I did research on these columns from the Christian Inquirer, and the editor at this time that I was researching was Henry Whitney Bellows, who was very big in the Unitarian Church, and he was an important figure in progressive viewpoints, as Brooke had mentioned. Like she said, they were progressive overall because they believed that everyone had inherent value. And so they took on these different challenges that they were facing in society, and they challenged the idea that it was okay to accept this as just what it was. And they wanted to change things in society. And so this newspaper covered all different topics. And as I was looking through the different folders with all these different topics, I started looking through a folder that was exclusively topics on slavery. And as I was initially going through the different clippings, I decided to cover the topic because as I was skimming through different ones, every different article had a different perspective. And so I decided to put it into chronological order to try to make sense of the different, like the inconsistencies in the perspectives on slavery. So once I put it in chronological order, I decided to dive into what the typical Unitarian perspective on the topic of slavery was because of their religious beliefs. When I went into it, I thought that they initially would have automatically considered slavery to be immoral and against their religion because this would go against their belief in an innate human value. But when I looked into it, there was actually 3 different perspectives on slavery, and they kind of had to do with the years too. So Unitarians could believe, one, that slavery shouldn't be expanded into any new territories. So this anti-expansionist principle would say that it wouldn't be right to continue to let slavery spread into any new territories, and so they wouldn't want any new territories to be acquired because they were scared of slavery getting even bigger and any worse than it already was. 2, they would believe that there was no moral right to slavery, but at the same time, they were very passive in it. It's something that Martin Luther King Jr. eventually called, he called it the white moderate And so these people they believe that something's wrong, but they're not going to actively challenge it, and they don't want to upset anyone with their opinions. And then the third one would be someone who deeply believes that the only right thing to do would be to end slavery completely and free anyone that is a slave. So, knowing this, I went into the articles and I started from 1847, which is about 15 years before World War II. So I found that it was very strongly an anti-expansion perspective at this time, because they even claimed that the first article that I saw said that every newspaper at this time should consider themselves an anti-expansion of slavery press. This is important in the North because it's important to recognize that it's one thing to ask that slavery does not spread. And it's also important that they are calling on other newspapers in the North to also promote the idea that expanding slavery is not going to be tolerated. Bellows, in one of his articles, he calls for a stop of slavery expanding and says that it will be the brightest day for the country when Congress finally calls for no new territories to accept any more slave states. After this, they go on and continue with this idea that anti-expansion is, the correct perspective, but as we know, there's a lot further to go in getting to that emancipationist argument. So I believe that in the following years, they start feeling guilty about this because they believe that mankind is inherently good and that there's value in every human life, not just in white life. And so they start to challenge different things like the Fugitive Slave Law. Fugitive Slave Law said that if a slave escaped to the North, the person who found them would have to return them to their owners. And Henry Whitney Bellows argued that this would be taking an active role in the product of slavery, and so he said that everyone should turn away from fugitive slave law and should not participate in returning slaves back to their owners, because this isn't what God would want. And this is, instead of passively ignoring the issue of slavery, this would be taking an active role in supporting slavery. So this is when we first see him challenging the idea that passivity is okay and that passivity would get them anywhere in society. As they continue, the next big turning point is the Nebraska Bill, which would have gone directly against their belief in anti-expansionism, because the Nebraska Bill would have allowed newly acquired territories to have states so that there would be an equal number of slave and non-slave states. And they published a lot on this topic because they felt it was very wrong to continue slavery into any new territories, and they felt that they had to do everything they could with this proposed bill to stop it from passing. And so this shows Unitarian optimism because they publish a story where they say no one has anything to fear with stopping this. It'll all work out. We don't have to worry about the economy, and everyone in the situation can be forgiven. We just need to repent for everything that has happened, and slave owners can be forgiven, slaves can be redeemed, and society can continue on in a better path. They call it a gloss upon the Constitution and a libel on civilization. And this is a very critical position because this is 1855. So people in the North were not even necessarily talking about freeing slaves, but this is going further and saying that slavery is a gross injustice and just makes us as a society look bad. And this is really important because, as a Northern paper, they are really criticizing anyone who is not taking a bold stance against this, which brings them to that second idea that slavery is not okay, but they aren't quite yet to a point where they are going to say that they should free everyone because of the economic consequences. But they're being very clear that, slavery is not right to have. So they start using other different methods, like printing sermons from different places and writing about different religions, like the Calvinists, who also believed that slavery was wrong. And even though Unitarians and Calvinists very much disagree on many things, Bellows said that he would support them because they supported getting rid of slavery. And it's clear that they finally stopped to consider what life would be like without slavery, because Bellows himself announces a platform that says he would rather the North and the South split than continue to accept the slave trade as a part of the country. This is important because before, no one was wanting to do anything to upset the South. They wanted to keep the South because it was a big part of the economy, and so anything that would upset the South was generally avoided. So Bellows himself calling for a divided country was huge. And in that article, he quotes the Constitution, which predicts the 13th Amendment, because he says that if all men should be able to pursue happiness, which is said in the Constitution, then all men have a right to freedom. And, he saw this flaw in the system before anyone else was willing to accept it and change the way our country was run, which is very important to recognize because this was so early in its development. They also start publishing things with more sympathy towards the slave community. They start publishing books like the autobiography of the female slave, which was written by a white woman who was seeing everything happening around her, and she wrote this book to show what was happening. And this was really important because it starts encouraging Northerners to engage with this literature and expose themselves to what is happening in the South. And instead of ignoring the problem, they would have to realize what is happening and form an opinion on slavery instead of neglecting the ideas altogether. They also published some stories which humanize slaves in a way that other papers weren't doing, because they believed that by talking about them in certain ways, they were putting this idea on Northerners who were reading their papers that they were less than and that they didn't have abilities. But of course, Unitarians see this ability in everyone, so they start to publish like features on African Americans who are doing great things, like this one child prodigy who was very good at playing musical piano. And this shows a different approach than the other ones, which challenged politicians and challenged bills that were being proposed. But it was still very important to their argument because it's important to recognize the emotional draw that it takes to convince people who are neglecting an idea altogether. So after this, it's huge because they publish What Can Save America. And this was the most harsh of any of the things that they published. They call slavery a crisis in America, and they say that at this point, everyone needs to immediately change because otherwise nothing will save us from the injustice that we're creating, and the values that we have aren't consistent with what the country was founded upon. And so they call for everyone to return to God, and they call for everyone also to stop worshiping the dollar. Now, this is really important to my further argument after this, because he was one of the first people to criticize this idea that we're driven by this nationalist and this greed that exists, and that we think that money is valued over human life. And so, therefore, these articles aren't just important to people studying a Unitarian's perspective on slavery, but to the whole idea of slavery in general, because it shows how the country could have let slavery go on for so long, because people are valuing money over human life. And so after I've outlined the entire chronological order of their ideas and how they got from this anti-expansionist idea to something which is calling for all slaves to be freed and that everyone deserves their chance at happiness and freedom, I compare the idea of manifest destiny, which is so important to slavery, to globalism. In the same way that Bellows suggests that manifest destiny is fueled by the dollar and immoral ideas of nationalism, which put our ideas over others, globalism is fueled by the same things. And so I believe that this is the same, these principles are very important because we're 150 years past these articles, and yet we're still seeing these ideas deeply ingrained in our society. So while he warned us of the idea that continuing to go down this path could lead us somewhere dreadful, and while we have gotten rid of slavery, we put ourselves in a position where the US still goes into other countries and may exploit them for political or economic gain. And modern slavery has taken the form of human trafficking. And this is possible because while we have this interconnected world where everyone can easily communicate and spread ideas, at the same time, we are even more aware of the rest of the world and more willing to challenge what other people are doing, compare ourselves. And Americans have a history of thinking that our ideas are better and the only way to do it. So all of this is to demonstrate how important the Christian Inquirer's arguments were, because what they said showed that, while we're a country that says that history will never repeat itself, these ideas still exist and are ingrained in our society. And so it makes it very clear that they're right and that passivity on issues will continue to lead us down a bad path.
Wow, 3 presentations that were just absolutely stellar. All of them in one way or another, informed by historical contextualization. The last of those 3 demonstrating that some 15 years before the advent of the Civil War, you had all of these ideas brewing and having implications even into this century. So now what we can do is, beginning with audience response to Mary Katherine, go back to her. And the way this will work ideally, and we have 10 minutes if we just simply extend this session by 5, which we've decided to do. If any member of the audience would, whether or not they've posed a question in chat, if they would verbally interject their questions. Now, I would ask the student to respond to each question out of regard for our time limitation in 1 minute or somewhat less. But anybody asking a question, feel free to take the time it needs to articulate that to your own specification. So again, I've got some questions, but I want to defer to our audience first. And who at this point may have a question for Mary Katherine Gowdy?
Okay, I have a question, Jim.
Sure, go for it.
Yeah. Hi, Mary Catherine. Interesting talk. And privilege seems to me to be something quite mysterious. It seems to be an object which can have, which there can be more or less of. It seems to be something that one can be born with, but on the other hand, it also seems to be an agent. I took that from two of your places. One is privilege sets the system. So setting is an agentive act done voluntarily. So it seems to be that privilege is, on the one hand, it's an object, but it also seems to be alive. Another verb which shows that is privilege is protection. To protect is to perform an agentive act. So I find privilege still a pretty mysterious thing. That's the,
Yeah.
I don't know if you have any comment about that. I've never thought about it before. So
Yes, I found like a couple examples too that also have privilege as like the agent that like protects people from like violence or harassment. It just wasn't the one of the most salient frames that I focused on. But I also did some preliminary research on this topic before using it for my capstone and found that like privilege is a gift, but it can also be like a giver of like individual privileges.
yeah.
Well, very nice, very nice. And thank you for that question, Dr. Ross. And now we will move to any member of the audience who has a question for Brooke Palmer.
Is it okay if I ask a question for Mary?
Absolutely, please do. This is Anna Phillips, who is currently in another class studying newspaper articles on a different topic from the same newspaper. Go ahead, Hannah.
Mary Catherine, I was wondering how you chose your commentators and if there was anybody that you wished you had gotten a chance to analyze that you didn't include in this study.
So there were a lot of like conservative commentators that I wanted to look at, and Rush Limbaugh and Bill O'Reilly were like two of the main ones. I also looked at like Sean Hannity, but I couldn't find any, like I had to find them talking about privilege, and that was a little difficult. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you for your response to that informed question. All right, so now we'll move on to Brooke. And who has a question or a comment about anything that Brooke covered? And speak right up. Well, I will, while you are deliberating, I will take the lead on a question for Brooke. And it's actually an observation, Brooke. And Brooke, are you there? If you say something, you're going to come right on the screen. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, there she is. All right. So as you move forward in your presentation, what I tended to know was that on the one hand, what you were suggesting about 2/3 of the way through the presentation was that for all of the progressivism of the Unitarian, that is to say, liberal Christian thinkers of the 19th century, they still were, as it were, tripping over their own shoestrings by being able conceptually only to go so far in terms of a progressive outlook on women in society. And, you know, I was saying, okay, I see where Brooke is going on that. And at the same time, then, when you ended your presentation, you were willing to cut them some slack, because after all, that was not the 20th century or the 21st century. So my question then is, can you articulate what the conflict was in your mind, and then what seems to be the reconciliation that you achieved between one's best effort and one's shortcoming, but a shortcoming defined in terms of a difference in mindset. So could you speak to those issues, both of which characterized your very impressive presentation?
Yes, absolutely. So I do find faults in the Unitarian thought on this topic. The reason that I cut them slack is because my analysis is from a very, very modern point of view. As I had said, there's still a lot of thinkers today who fail to reconciliate their progressive thoughts with their intercultural thoughts. But I don't feel hesitant in faulting the Unitarians for this problem, because this is a historical perspective, but by analyzing the perspective and putting modern twists on it, we can continue to advance from where we are now.
Okay, very good. And just as we allowed Mary Catherine 2 questions, so I'm changing up the initial guidelines here. Is there anybody who would like to follow with a further question for Brooke at this time?
Hi, Brooke. I was wondering if you did any looking into the church law, like surrounding women in the Unitarian Church at the time as well. Like if they're like, you know, these analyses that were written, these editorials were about women outside of the influence of the church and who were, you know, in different countries. And I was wondering what like the internal perspective in the church on women was like, and if that played into your analysis at all.
At this moment in time, my full paper is simply an analysis on what I read from the Christian Inquirer. I'm actually, you could say, about halfway through, because from this point forward, I would want to add sources about Unitarian law and outside sources on how cultures perceived themselves rather than how Unitarians perceived them. So I haven't yet, but that is a plan for this upcoming year.
Very nice indeed, very nice. Well, thank you for those questions to Brooke, and thank you, Brooke, for your truly learned response to both of those questions. And now we'll move on to Talia, and the questions to her will close our session today, since we're approaching the 5-minute mark beyond where we originally started. So Talia, could you simply let us know you're there, and you will assume center screen when the computer hears your voice?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, there you are indeed. So again, let me ask members of the audience who has a question for Talia, and if time allows, I'll have an observation, but who might wish to ask a question? And by the way, I did see one chat question that asked if the Unitarians were the first in the 19th century to oppose slavery, and the Quakers had already been there for some time. But in any event, who else has a question for Talia? Well, let me take the lead then. And it's less a question than it is an observation. And what Talia faced, she had a group of newspaper articles that were very diverse in emphasis, anywhere from saying, we don't really abide slavery, but I guess we're not abolitionists and we're not willing to see the Union torn apart for this, to any number of waverings, and then the more extreme. Now, wait a minute, this is totally immoral, so we're not going to abide it. And just one of the things I'd like to note is that it may seem simple in hindsight, but at the time that you, Talia, were confronting these issues, to simply juggle all those articles chronologically and like a kaleidoscope to have a definite pattern appear was really quite an accomplishment, to be able to make sense out of a series of disparate points of view by putting them in chronological order. So there was kind of an intuitive methodology. So I guess my question to you, Talia, would be, what was that moment where you said, now wait a minute, I think I'm going to put these in chronological order? How did the researcher part of you finally come to that insight?
Yeah, I think when I was first looking at them, I was as confused as you would have been, anyone would have been, looking through those. And so it was really learning that the Unitarians had three different perspectives that I was able to arrange everything in my mind. So I really just took the whole stack and put everything in order. And I would start looking for key moments, and then I would do research on the social and the political context to each situation. So like for the Nebraska Bill, I had to look into what perspectives were on that. And I found that sorting everything chronologically was the only thing that made sense to argue that their views were progressing through time.
Very nice indeed. And do we have a final question for Talia?
I've asked a lot of questions, so I do have one, but if anyone else wants to go, I would like them to take priority over me.
Going once, twice, thrice, it's yours, Hannah.
Okay, great. So anti-expansionism was a pretty common political mindset at the time in the North because of political reasons of like slave and non-slave states having equal political power. At what point do you think, do you think that anti-expansionism was more of a political or a theological standpoint for the Unitarians? And at what point do you feel like it became more theological than political, if any?
Yeah, I think you're right in saying that that was common, because you're right, there was the argument that the North didn't want the South to have any more power over them. I think that it became theological when they started arguing that it wasn't just about the arguments between the two places, but that slavery was immoral and they couldn't bear to see it expanding anymore. And so at that point, it becomes a moral and a religious point of view rather than just wanting to have more power than the South did.
Okay, thank you. And let me just finally add that I very much respected the way that you used as a point of departure the historical situation of the 19th century for launching into 20th and 21st century globalistic concerns. In sum, I would like to commend each and every presenter for a job very well done. And I would like to thank all of the faculty members who joined today or who had a direct hand in overseeing this kind of research. And I think what we saw here today was truly the value of research-based undergraduate education and the exquisite results that it can yield. This was a wonderful panel. I can think of many panel presentations at professional conferences for which this rose to those level those levels of standards, of research, of articulation. And also, I so respected the students' ability, after so many months of research, and in some cases years, somehow to compress all of that knowledge into such concise utterance. Well done. So thank you all, and we're going to sign off.